Jay Blades, the gentle, warm-hearted face of the repair shop, has become a symbol of hope, restoring not just antiques, but the memories tied to them. Viewers see a calm, compassionate craftsman who can bring the most broken treasures back to life. But behind that reassuring smile lies a story far more fractured than any heirloom brought to his bench. What if the one thing Jay could never truly repair was his own past? Hidden behind the TV magic are years of pain, loss, and battles he never wanted the world to see. This is the untold, heartbreaking journey of Jay Blades, and it's far darker than anyone imagined. Behind the tools and the tearful reunions, Jay Blades' life was shaped by pain, resilience, and battles he rarely spoke about. Long before the repair shop made him a household name, his own world felt fractured. Home, school, even his sense of self seemed broken. Growing up on a tough council estate in Hackney, East London, the surroundings were as grey as the concrete blocks that towered over him. Narrow gangways and paper-thin walls meant every argument, every slammed door, every moment of chaos echoed through the flats. Inside their small home, Jay lived with his mother and half-brother, while the shadow of an absent father loomed large over his childhood. Money was a constant struggle, and survival often felt like the only goal. It was an environment where dreams were hard to hold on to, and where the boy who would one day mend the world's treasures was left to navigate the cracks in his own life. When something broke in the Blades household, a chair, a toy, a bike, there was no question of replacing it. Money simply didn't allow for that. Instead, things had to be fixed, and out of that necessity, young Jay became a natural-born tinkerer. A wobbly chair leg became a weekend mission. A punctured bicycle tire meant hours learning how to patch an inner tube. He taught himself to saw, sand, glue, and repair with whatever scraps and tools were at hand. Each small victory, a rusty hinge freed, a loose screw tightened, gave him a rare spark of pride in a world that didn't offer him many reasons to feel capable. Home and school might have felt like hostile territory, but when Jay picked up a hammer or a paintbrush, the noise around him faded. It was in those quiet moments of creation that he felt calm and in control. But school was a battlefield he couldn't escape. The words on the page refused to stay still, letters blurred, twisted, and rearranged themselves into puzzles he couldn't solve. Year after year, the struggle continued, and no one knew why. His dyslexia went undiagnosed throughout his entire childhood, leaving him to wrestle with frustration and self-doubt in silence. Teachers noticed a boy who was struggling and jumped to the conclusion that he was either lazy or uninterested. Jay learned to mask his confusion. He took on the role of the class clown, making jokes and fooling around to distract from his hidden struggles. Each laugh he received helped to conceal the shame that washed over him whenever a teacher called on him to read aloud. Beyond the classroom, Jay confronted another harsh truth: racism. Even before reaching his teenage years, he was stopped by police just for walking home. Strangers would cross to the opposite side of the street upon seeing him approach. Other kids hurled insults that hurt more than any tumble on the playground. These experiences left deep impressions on Jay's young psyche. He quickly learned that the world would judge him based on his skin color before he even had a chance to speak. However, none of this deterred Jay from returning to his workbench repeatedly. Fixing a broken toy gave him a sense of purpose. Restoring a damaged picture frame reminded him that not all damage is irreversible. In those moments of concentration, measuring, tightening, and repainting, he found a sanctuary from the chaos and fear that resonated throughout his neighborhood. Unbeknownst to him at the time, these early acts of repair would shape the trajectory of his life. The skills he honed in a small apartment would eventually become the tools for a new mission: to show millions that no matter how broken something or someone may seem, it can be restored. From Hackney to nowhere. In 1986, at the age of 16, Jay Blades left school in Hackney without any qualifications. He packed a few belongings and took a bus out of London to Luton, hoping that a new town would bring him better fortune. Instead, he spent the following years pursuing temporary labor jobs, loading crates in warehouses, sweeping factory floors, stacking pallets in distribution centers, and moving bricks on construction sites. Although the job was honest, the money was wasted on subpar meals and housing. Jay quickly questioned whether he had made the proper decision after feeling unanchored. Jay wandered back to London in his early 20s around 1990, with everything he possessed in a single supermarket carrier bag. When he could, he slept on friends' couches. When that was exhausted, he stayed at Salvation Army hostels designed for older men. He felt more alone despite the noise of the city pressing in on him. While he continued to live in survival mode, hopping from one dead-end job to another, he observed colleagues establish families and settle into careers. There was always violence around. On street corners, tensions erupted, and Jay acknowledges that he got into more fights than he would want to recall. Every battle served as a warning. It was simple to fall into risky crowds and face worse outcomes if there was no clear goal or strategy. One wrong step and I could end up on the wrong side of the law, he would think to himself. Meanwhile, he was plagued by a somber prophecy from a teacher. Teenage Jay was told plainly by a job advisor in 1984 that he would never amount to anything. That decision consumed his thoughts and stoked his anxieties. Jay heard that voice telling him he was useless every time he received a notice of low rent from another irate landlord or an inebriated neighbor. Nevertheless, Jay persisted even at his worst moments. He took on odd freelancing jobs, such as mending doors, repainting picture frames, and reupholstering old chairs, when factory labor paid too little. At the time, he had no idea that these menial occupations would lead to a more lucrative profession. But every job he finished served as a reminder that he was still valuable, talented, and creative. Jay, who was in his mid-20s by 1995, had experienced the sense of purposelessness and the promise that came with fixing broken things. He kept that flame burning through gloomy evenings and violent, bloody altercations on sidewalks. All he had was a torn carrier bag and a silent belief that there must be a life worth fighting for somewhere beyond fatigue and hopelessness. During that agitated time, Jay discovered an important lesson. Not all directions come on time. Sometimes you have to take baby steps to navigate uncertainty. One task at a time, one fix, one new ability. And eventually, those actions can guide you in the direction of education, which is something far bigger than you could have ever dreamed. Jay Blades felt as though he had lived his life to the fullest by the time he turned 31. His 20s were filled with dead ends, rented couches, and low-paying employment. For years, he had been aimless, lugging not just material possessions in plastic bags but also emotional burdens. Recollections of rejection, failure, and ongoing misunderstandings. He had learned how to live on the streets, but not how to construct. Then, even he was taken aback by the choice. He submitted an application to college. Despite having no academic credentials, no formal training, and little knowledge of what lay ahead, Jay took a chance and was admitted to study criminology at Buckinghamshire New. It wasn't a well-thought-out move or a lifetime dream. It was an attempt to reclaim something he had never had, a mixture of optimism and despair. Jay was a stranger as he walked into the classroom. The majority of his classmates had just finished school. They used scholarly language with ease. Uncertain if he even belonged, Jay remained silent. He soon faced his first significant obstacle in the form of a literacy exam. The outcomes were incisive. He could read as well as an 11-year-old. Jay had always known this, but he never wanted to confront it directly, and it was a painful confirmation of it. He was not a good reader. Not to the standard of a college student. But he decided to stay rather than succumb to shame. It was a fearlessness that was strange. That, in his own words, gave me the go-ahead to tell folks I have dyslexia. Returning to the basics, he began with children's books, sounded out words by himself at night, and sought assistance from anyone who was patient enough to offer it. Jay Blades, a man who restores damaged items to life, is regarded as the repair shop's serene and kind soul. But what if his own past was the one thing he found most difficult to change? The surface is all that viewers see on screen. Jay Blades from the repair shop has a heartbreaking story that is worse than we initially believed. Beneath the instruments and emotional reunions is a life filled with suffering, resiliency, and unsaid struggles. What would have caused him to come so near the brink? How did he make it through it all? Rooted in the estate of Hackney. Jay Blade's own life was filled with broken items before he gained notoriety for repairing other people's memories on the repair shop. His home, his school, and even his identity. He was raised in Hackney, East London, on a poor council estate. The block was cramped and drab, with thin walls and small gangways that allowed every thump and shout to reverberate through the apartments. Jay, his mother, and his half-brother resided there. His dad wasn't there. There was never enough money. There was no money set aside to replace a chair, toy, or bike that broke. It needed to be fixed. Jay became a tinkerer by necessity. His project over the weekend was a wobbly chair leg. He gained knowledge of adhesive, sanding, and sawing. He learned how to mend inner tubes from a punctured bicycle tire. Every minor triumph, rusty hinge, or loose screw fixed brought him a sense of pride that he was unable to obtain elsewhere. Jay felt calm and capable when he held a paintbrush or hammer, but both home and school felt hostile. Every day was a struggle in school. Jay was illiterate. The page was filled with swirling, changing letters. The words appeared to be jumbled puzzle pieces. He was unsure about the issue. During his whole childhood, his dyslexia remained undiagnosed. When teachers noticed a struggling boy, they concluded he was lazy or uninterested. Jay became adept at concealing his bewilderment. He turned into the class clown, making jokes and acting goofy to hide his secret. The embarrassment he had whenever a teacher asked him to read aloud was obscured by each giggle he received. Racism was another hard reality that Jay had to deal with outside of the classroom. He was pulled over by the cops for just walking home before he was even a teenager. When they spotted him approaching, they moved to the opposite side of the street. The insults that other kids slung hurt more than any playground tumble. Jay's impressionable mind was permanently altered by these experiences. Before he even opened his words, he discovered early on that people might assess him by his appearance. However, Jay continued to return to his workbench despite all of this. Fixing a damaged toy gave him a sense of utility. He was reminded that harm isn't always irreversible by restoring a damaged picture frame. He found a haven from the clamor and terror that reverberated throughout his land during those concentrated moments of measuring, tightening, and repainting. His life would be shaped by these early acts of healing, which he was unaware of at the time. One day, the tools he learned to use in a little apartment might be used for something else. Demonstrating to millions that everything or anyone can be restored to its original state, regardless of how severely damaged they are. To nowhere from Hackney. Jay Blades, then 16 years old, dropped out of Hackney School in 1986 without a single credential. In the hopes that a new place would improve his lot, he packed a few clothing and boarded a bus for Luton from London. He instead spent the following several years looking for temporary work, moving bricks on construction sites, sweeping factory floors, loading crates in warehouses, and stacking pallets in distribution centers. Although the job was honest, the money was wasted on subpar meals and housing. Jay quickly questioned whether he had made the proper decision after feeling unanchored. Jay wandered back to London in his early 20s around 1990, with everything he possessed in a single supermarket carrier bag. When he could, he slept on friends' couches. When that was exhausted, he stayed at Salvation Army hostels designed for older men. He felt more alone despite the noise of the city pressing in on him. While he continued to live in survival mode, hopping from one dead-end job to another, he observed colleagues establish families and settle into careers. There was always violence around. On street corners, tensions erupted, and Jay acknowledges that he got into more fights than he would want to recall. Every battle served as a warning. It was simple to fall into risky crowds and face worse outcomes if there was no clear goal or strategy. One wrong step and I could end up on the wrong side of the law, he would think to himself. Meanwhile, he was plagued by a somber prophecy from a teacher. Teenage Jay was told plainly by a job advisor in 1984 that he would never amount to anything. That decision consumed his thoughts and stoked his anxieties. Jay heard that voice telling him he was useless every time he received a notice of low rent from another irate landlord or an inebriated neighbor. Nevertheless, Jay persisted even at his worst moments. He took odd freelance jobs fixing doors, repainting picture frames, and reholstering old chairs when factory labor didn't pay well enough. At the time, he had no idea that these menial occupations would lead to a more lucrative profession. But every job he finished served as a reminder that he was still valuable, talented, and creative. Jay, who was in his mid-20s by 1995, had experienced the hopeless grind as well as the glimmer of possibility that came with confronting his darkest idea to date. He nearly thought that taking his own life was the only way out. But something started when Jade called. Jay was permitted to go with a friend, Gerald Bailey, who owned the Diffusion fashion chain, instead of being admitted to the hospital. Jay believes that this person saved his life. Years of suffering and pride finally came to an end when he sat in Gerald's automobile. He broke down in tears, releasing the intense, stomach-churning sorrow he had suppressed for so long. He had been brought up to be tough and never cry, therefore this was the first time he had shed a tear in front of a man. The numbness that had been weighing him down was relieved when the sobbing ceased, and he felt fully alive for the first time in a long time. During Jay's recuperation, Gerald made arrangements for him to remain with his mother and stepfather, who soon became like a second family. At the age of 45, Jay, who lived with them, had what he called a rebirth. While he took care of them, they took care of him, prepared meals, and provided support. According to Jay, this period turned into the most exquisite second childhood he had ever experienced. Although Jay's issues were not resolved by this catastrophe, it was a watershed. It reminded him that a single act of compassion is typically the first step towards repairing anything, be it a chair or a life, and it demonstrated that even in his darkest hour, someone was concerned enough to find him. The unanticipated lifeline. Jay Blades was a guy in silent retreat by the beginning of 2017. It was difficult to overlook the wounds caused by Out of the Dark's demise, his marriage's disintegration, and the eerie nights spent sleeping in his car. The emotional toll persisted even though he was temporarily housed with close friends and was no longer homeless. His once purposeful world has become a mute emptiness. However, Jay would subsequently remark that occasionally the unexpected starts to emerge amid that quiet. A researcher saw a brief film about Out of the Dark somewhere in a BBC office. In the silent, dusty video, Jay was shown teaching young people how to restore furniture. He moved, spoke, and listened in a way that resonated. A call was placed after a producer left a note. The concept was straightforward. They were working on a new pilot for repairing valuables. Saving tails is just as important as repairing furniture. Would Jay be open to attending a screening? Jay didn't jump at the chance when he got the call. He was not in a position to see himself on TV. Years of survival had eroded his self-confidence. However, the invitation sparked a glimmer of interest. He had nothing to lose. More significantly, he continued to believe in the ability of people, not just things, to be repaired. He entered the BBC studio cautiously, not knowing what to anticipate. With its tools, benches, and sawdust in the air, the set looked like a workshop. While they were filming, they gave him a piece of worn furniture and asked him to fix it. Something changed when his hands began to operate. He emerged from the haze he had been living in with each turn of the screw and stroke of the sandpaper. Fixing a chair wasn't all that was involved. It was about recalling his former self. Jay experienced an emotion he hadn't felt in a long time at the test's conclusion. Goal. He realized that this moment was important, even if there was no assurance that the show would air or that he would become famous. Even though the studio lighting were fake, the atmosphere was authentic. He saw the start of a way forward for the first time in years. Nevertheless, one terrible reality still prevented him from moving forward, both behind and beneath the camera. Jay Blades was 51 years old and yet illiterate. Not very well. Not above the level of an 11-year-old. He was aware that he couldn't conceal this chance indefinitely if it developed into something more. He'd have to deal with it the same way he'd dealt with all the broken things. The pilot was finished. The actual restoration, however, had only just started for Jay. From television displays to the floors of workshops. The repair shop subtly transitioned from pilot to full series by 2017. It was a reassuring show about repairing cherished items for many viewers. However, beneath its soothing tones and affectionate craftsmanship was the tragic story of Blades, which was presented through silent suffering and quiet resiliency rather than narration. Jay's presentation skills were lacking. He didn't train for television. Instead, he contributed his actual experience. Years of heartache, destitution, and difficult recovery. It was more than a set. It became his haven. The emotional significance of each item, a mother's treasured sewing box, a father's shattered clock, was discussed by the guests as the cameras filmed. Jay listened out of recognition rather than obligation. He had lost something. He was aware that wood glue wasn't always the first step in restoration. Listening was the first step. Because the Restore Keep group grew with people like Susie Fletcher, Will Kirk, and Dominic Chana, Jay discovered himself part of a new sort of family. The work they did wasn't flashy, however it mattered. Each restored item reflected something non-public for Jay. Grief, memory, love deferred, and every so often forgiveness. Viewers saw the upkeep. What they failed to see became that Jay was additionally restoring elements of himself. The display resonated deeply with the general public. Letters arrived from strangers who had lost cherished ones or felt unseen in their personal lives. They thanked Jay for actually being actual. His mild questions, his willingness to be prone, struck a chord. But, at the same time as popularity grew, he became hiding a quiet reality. Blades could not examine. For most of his lifestyles, he had masked his illiteracy via memorizing signs and symptoms, guessing forms, and relying on others to explain things aloud. It was a mystery rooted in shame, formed by way of a damaged training device that did not trap him as a boy. However, in 2021, Jay decided he wouldn't carry that silence anymore. He started out gaining knowledge of to read through a charity referred to as Read Easy United Kingdom. It wasn't clean. The training had been humbling, slow, and once in a while irritating. But Jay approached it like he did every recovery with endurance and purpose. This deeply non-public adventure turned into later captured inside the BBC documentary Jay Blades, Gaining Knowledge of to Examine at 51. The person recognized for fixing broken matters on screen was now repairing something nobody else could see. His very own forgotten self-assurance. Jay's tragic story from the repair save wasn't about items to repair. It became about redemption. And in studying to study, he reminded the arena that it's by no means too overdue to repair what once felt lost. Held together by means of hope. By the time Blades had become a familiar face on British television, recognized for his warmth, empathy, and the gentle rhythm of his paintings on the repair save, he had already survived storms that would spoil many. Homelessness, heartbreak, and the long shadow of illiteracy had formed him. Repute came now not as a praise, but as some other chapter in a life tough earned. In 2021, sparkling from mastering to study, Jay met Lisa Maurice Zan, a health professional with a deep soul and a steady heart. Their connection became quiet however profound. Folks who valued healing and inner power extra than noise. Jay had spent decades supporting others repair damaged matters. In Lisa, he found someone who helped restore components of himself. Their marriage in November 2022 became intimate, held underneath the nice and cozy sky of Barbados. No red carpets, no television cameras, simply love, simplicity, and the quiet wish of a person who had come thus far. Their rings were handmade through Richard Tolman, considered one of Jay's closest colleagues from the repair shop, as if tying this new beginning to the craft that had stored him. But even love cannot usually mend the wounds we feature interior. As time went on, the load of Jay's agenda, the needs of reputation, and the emotional residue of a tough past started to take their toll. In early 2024, Lisa shared truly without anger that they had separated. For Jay, it became every other kind of heartbreak. Non-public, quiet, painful, and yet real to who he has usually been, he did no longer crumble. He moved forward. Blades' story became by no means approximately perfection. It was about survival, about sitting in silence when hope goes dim and status lower back up anyway. Even if he had no roof, no money, no route, even when he lost the humans he cherished. Nowadays, Jay remains the anchor of the Restore Keep, an image no longer just of craft, however of care. He still walks into that barn with a deep know-how of the way precious damaged matters can be. And now more than ever, his lifestyle mirrors the very gadgets he helps repair. Worn, wounded, however worthy. He contains the unhappiness of what's been misplaced, however also the pride of how a ways he's come. And in real Jay style, he continues going. Due to the fact that is what he does. If Jay can rebuild from a lot pain, what does that say about the broken parts we disguise? Allow us to realize what part of his tale hit you toughest. Bear in mind to like, subscribe, and switch on notifications for extra untold tales like this one. Until next time.